Hi, I'm Christine Capra, and I developed this framework that I call Presencing the Active Feminine, which is all about utilizing the catalytic or transformational aspects of the feminine in all of us to inform and support social change. So today's video tells the story of how this framework came about. And so I hope you enjoy the story, and thanks for watching. At a cosmic level, I'd say that my purpose all along has been to live into a particular paradox and to try to make sense of a riddle that paradox presents. And the riddle is, how could the archetype of the sacred prostitute inform and support social change? Now, of course, I know that right off the bat, to most people, that's an utterly nonsensical question. I mean, who would even think of such a thing? But so that's part of the riddle. Why would it even matter? And who would it matter to? So let's start there and begin to understand at least those two parts of the riddle. So let's think about all of the social movements that have emerged in the last decade or so that are aimed at creating a more just and sustainable future for humanity and for the planet. So for instance, there's transition towns, and there's Occupy, and there's the Shift Network and the Great Turning. And at the same time, all these new change methodologies have emerged, which are designed to help organizations and groups, large and small, manage change and make decisions in ways that are more inclusive and democratic, so that they can become more resilient and more innovative. So there's Theory U, and there's Open Space Technology, and there's World Cafe, and Human Systems Dynamics, and the Art of Convening. So there's all these wonderful new ideas and visions floating around out there, and people are hearing about them and getting inspired and excited and hopeful. And so whether it's that they actually want to take part in the movements, or they want to take the methodologies and introduce them into their workplaces or their community work, or their church groups, or their schools, or their families, but whatever it is, they just really want to be part of this exciting new future that we're imagining that we can create together. So then add to that the understanding that most of these movements and methods are built on the recognition that if we want to produce different outcomes, we actually have to approach those outcomes using different processes. And in order to actually implement different processes, we actually need to be different people within those processes. So this is where we recognize that, if we just show up with our same old beliefs and our same old prejudices and our same old habits of communication and patterns of interaction, that what we're going to end up with is the same old process. And we may call it by a different name, but it's going to feel the same as it ever has. And all that's going to do is reproduce the same old kinds of results. And so this is when, when people talk about being the change that they want to see in the world, or who are you going to show up as, or, how we're showing up. It's the understanding that the quality of our presence, moment to moment, actually has a huge impact on the results that we create. So there are all these people showing up, and they're excited and inspired and happy to be involved. And at the same time, there's a smaller group that's also showing up excited, but pretty quickly they're getting disappointed and even frustrated, because they sense that at the level of being the change that we want to see in the world, we've still just barely begun to scratch the surface. So, whether it's that they anticipated a greater sense of connection in doing this work, or they were looking for more inclusivity than they're finding, or more self-organizing and less top-down leadership, but whatever it is, it's just not happening. And so it's like as if they sense that there's something deeper and more profound that still needs to be part of the mix. And so for them, it's like there's an important piece of the puzzle that's still missing. So it's at that level of being that my riddle begins to become relevant. And who my riddle is relevant to is those people who are showing up and quickly getting frustrated at how superficially we still seem to be being that change that we want to see in the world, and at how hard it is to push for anything deeper in our group work. So it's those disappointed and frustrated people that my riddle speaks to. And they're the ones that I'm inviting to join me and others in creating a paradigm shift that I believe will help them to begin to bring that greater depth and meaning that they're yearning for into their group work, which will then release that inherent potential that they know exists within their colleagues and within the group as a whole, so that together they can begin to create that more meaningful and lasting transformation that we're all yearning for. Well, so let me back up a little bit and share with you some of where that paradox comes from for me. I grew up on welfare in housing projects. I was the oldest of 3 kids of a single mom who was mentally ill. So mom would go in and out of psych wards periodically as we were growing up, which meant that sometimes we would get put in horrible foster homes, and sometimes she would leave us with neighbors that we hardly even knew. And as I got older, she would leave my younger brothers home alone with me. And so between the chaos of being bounced around and the violence of the housing projects, I had to toughen up pretty young. So first I learned how to fight back, and then I learned how to scare people so they wouldn't pick a fight with me in the first place. And so that meant I had to learn how to hide my fear and hide my sadness. And so by the time I was about 8 or 9 years old, I would say that I was already really shielded. And anything that smacked of vulnerability, whether it was in me or in anybody else, just gave me an upset stomach, and I just wanted to eradicate it. But at the same time that my mother was often so depressed that she couldn't even get out of bed for months on end, she was also a brilliant woman, and she was always seeking. So as I was growing up, we were Wiccans, we were socialists, we were Hindu, and she sent my younger brothers and I to a hippie alternative free school looking for a better kind of education. And I always had this sense that she was like she was grooming me to be sort of a modern day Joan of Arc. For instance, like it was really important to her that I understand things in a broader context. So for example, if there were racial tensions in the projects, and it was the 60s, so of course there were, she taught me all about the history of slavery and racism and all about the civil rights movement, and just, it was like she really wanted to make sure that I understood my personal experience within the context of a broader, the historical and political systems that we all existed in, so that I wouldn't get too caught up in my own story about what was going on, and have a broader understanding. She also, made sure that I learned how to meditate and practiced regularly, and learned yoga and practiced, and she was always encouraging me to develop my psychic abilities. And she also she didn't push exactly, but she really encouraged me to be courageous and to be bold and to stand up for myself, and to take risks. And so all during adolescence, I was always getting involved in one kind of movement or another. Like in the free school, I was on every committee that ever existed, I think, and I was on the governing board for years, and there were always marches and meetings and sit-ins and policy statements to be drafted, and there was like a never-ending stream of isms to be combated. And then when I was 17, I came out as a lesbian. So then, of course, I was involved in the gay rights movement, and marching on Washington, and gay pride and education committee. But while I was doing all of this amazing work in the world, and people admired me and they thought I was bold and interesting, the truth is I didn't really have any friends, and I didn't know how to keep any kind of relationship intact whatsoever. And I didn't know how to study. I started at the university, and it totally freaked me out, and I quit in about 3 weeks. And aside from, basic, really minimum wage level jobs, I had no idea how to make a living. And so I just had no idea how I was going to make my way as an adult in the world. And so by the time I was about 18 or 19 years old, this whole Joan of Arc thing, it just felt like a setup. It felt like, here I'm preparing to save the world. And I don't even know how to take care of myself in the most fundamental ways. But then when I was about 18 years old, I had the really good luck to get to work with a local Jungian analyst, Noor Hall, who had just finished writing a popular book about the 4 fundamental Jungian feminine archetypes. And that got me started doing all this reading about Jungian theory and especially the feminist Jungians. And so between this reading that I was doing and the dream work that I did with Noor over the course of about 3 years, it really made me start to understand that my relationship to myself as a woman or as a feminine person was really problematic. And that until I began to understand how my shadow and my unconscious were in a lot of ways undermining what it was I was trying to do and could be more self-aware of those things, the whole project of saving the world was just a little bit premature. And one aspect of Jungian theory that I found really compelling was an idea that Jung had borrowed from the medieval alchemists, and they in turn had borrowed it from the ancient Greeks. And that was this concept of the hieros gamos. And the hieros gamos literally means sacred marriage. So it was the marriage of the god and the goddess. And so this was a representation of the intimate union of opposites. And it's not just the masculine and the feminine that are coming together in the hieros gamos. It's all of these polar opposites that we normally think of as immiscible and at war with one another. So it was, matter and spirit coming together, or body and soul, or dark and light, or hard and soft. And so this is a paradox, and it's at the key for Jung and for the ancients. It's the foundation of transformation and of healing. And so this paradox is the one that I'm talking about trying to live into for my whole life. And for me, it was about, in part, this sort of beginning to understand that this habitual heroic toughness of mine actually made me weak, and that a more feminine openness and vulnerability could be a source of strength. And so there's this paradox of the union of opposites. And then of the 4 fundamental feminine archetypes, the one that really resonated for me, that I felt like was just calling out to me, was the archetype of the Hetaira. And the Hetaira were highly respected prostitutes in ancient Greece. And this is a much richer archetype than the way we normally stereotype prostitutes nowadays. And so the Hetaira is actually the aspect of the feminine that is enacting that sacred marriage with the masculine. She's all about being feminine in the company of the masculine and understanding the masculine and challenging the masculine and uniting with it. And so to me it felt like that archetype was very much the aspect of myself that I needed to get far more in touch with and understand in order to heal some of my own issues. And at the same time, that's where the paradox of the union of opposites then, for me, presented a riddle. And the riddle was, how could it be that such a potentially healing and transformational aspect of what's a part of what's natural in all women, for that to become so demonized and so repressed in our culture? And so that just, I felt driven to understand that riddle about the conflict between our culture and the Hetaira archetype. And it felt to me like if I could find the answer to that would contribute a lot more to this, project of saving the world than the way I'd been approaching it. And it just started to feel like that whole heroic approach was just an empty shell without a soul. And eventually, as the mostly experiential and visceral learner that I was at that point in my life, and having been raised to be transgressive and to take risks, and with no other real options as far as I could see, and feeling as pulled into this riddle as it was that I was chasing after it, it seemed like the thing to do was to jump in and to start to gather some information. So ultimately I moved to New York and became a prostitute. And as a prostitute, I gathered a lot of clues to that riddle. And I learned a lot about both myself and about the world. I learned about men and masculinity, and I learned about money and value, and I learned about the layers of reality and illusion and how we construct those layers and then how we use them to attribute value. And I learned about power and about fear and about vulnerability and about humiliation. And ultimately, I learned a lot about self-worth and about resilience. Well, literal prostitution was much more about a learning and an experience for me than it was about a long-term career. And so eventually I ended up back in Minneapolis. And as a learning, it required distillation through conversation and exploration. And so it had never been my intention to hide what I'd been doing or keep it a secret. And so once I got home, I went around talking about it, looking for sounding boards and input. And it was like, I had gathered this basket full of clues to my riddle, and they were abundant and they were rich, and I needed help in understanding how all the pieces fit together. But over time I began to realize that no matter what people said they felt about my past, how accepting they seemed to be, and no matter what they thought about me, that there was a way in which in their minds I just existed in this little tiny box, and any aspect of me that in reality didn't fit in that box, they just didn't see it at all. And I started to realize that there were people that I thought were my friends that really I was just their pet project. It was like they would feel, they just wanted me around so they could feel good about themselves because they were helping an ex-whore get her life back on track. And to me that was just utterly unacceptable, because as far as I was concerned, I was not broken and I did not need fixing. I was on a quest and they just didn't get it. A really interesting paradox of having been a prostitute is that for the rest of my life, I have never been willing to let anybody else dictate what my reality should be. And so I started to realize that all of these well-intentioned do-gooders, all they were doing was undermining my sense of self and my sense of agency by projecting their vision onto me of me as a broken person or as some hapless victim that they needed to fix. And so even though it was never my intention to keep it a secret or to hide anything, I started to realize that I had to do that in order to protect my own sense of direction and my purpose in life. And once I had pulled the plug on that toxic life support system that I had been enmeshed in, I was finally able to see what it was that I really needed to do with my precious basket of clues to the riddle. And that was to stop, sharing them around so liberally, and to, maybe set it down and to protect it and to let it gestate in the dark for a while. And in the meantime, I needed to go out and to gather the resources, both internal and external, that would give me the freedom to follow my own vision. And so I went back to college and I ended up graduating summa cum laude. And I, got more clear about what it was preventing me to be in relationships. And I got married, and I've, been married to the same guy ever since for the last 25 years. And over time, we developed a really nice, stable life together, and I developed a well-paying career. And so in the end, I did become your sort of classic, ex-whore makes good story, but the fixers weren't around to enjoy it. So then I spent the next, more than 20 years climbing the corporate ladder. And you could say that I've sold out, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm still on a quest. It's just become a top secret one. And that riddle, it still pulls at me as strongly as it ever did. And I still have my basket of clues, which are always sort of whispering to me in the background everywhere I go. But I never share the insights that they give me with anybody anymore. So it's kind of like, as a kid, I had to learn your, macho street-level survival skills. And then as a young woman, as a prostitute, I learned the power of polar opposites and attraction and surrender. And now it felt like I needed to learn how to understand and work with the civilized power, or the corporate power, which was hierarchical and top down and bottom line, results oriented, and command and control. And I really enjoyed my career. I mean, I always had interesting challenges to grapple with, and I moved up into leadership positions pretty quickly, and I really enjoyed leadership. And but there was an aspect to it that I just found really frustrating, and that was that in organizations, I mean, even back to the free school days, all kinds of organizations in any kind of context, whenever you get a bunch of people together, there are always problems, and there's always room for improvement. And there are also always a lot of people within any given system that have really good ideas for how to make it better. But there's just something about organizational life that just makes it so hard to implement any kind of change. And it's like there's this force of gravitational pull back to the status quo. And even if you do get something started rolling, it's just really hard to maintain any kind of momentum without, constant energy being put into it. And I'm not talking about, like radical left-wing out there kind of change. I'm talking about the kind of changes that would help employees do their jobs better, or the kind of changes that would help us deliver what our clients were actually asking for, just stuff that was good for the organization. And eventually this resistance to movement, I found it so frustrating that I decided to get a master's degree in organizational leadership in hopes that it would teach me how to break through some of those blockages that were driving me nuts. So I enrolled in this master's program out of frustration at how hard it is to get anything to move in organizations. And then right off the bat, the secrecy of my quest got called into question. Now, this was the oldest master's program in organizational leadership in the country, and it was housed in a progressive women's Catholic university. And it placed a lot of emphasis and priority on ethics and integrity. And so we were always talking about authenticity and trust and trustworthiness and showing up whole in terms of body and mind and heart and soul all being together. And I'm a pretty expressive person, so I know that in most of my places of work, people considered me fairly authentic. But I knew how much of myself I was leaving at the door, and I knew how often I was biting my tongue. And so this discrepancy between who I really was and who I was showing up as made me start to question my own integrity, which I found really uncomfortable. And this sort of, superficial authenticity that I was displaying made me begin to wonder if that had something to do with how I always had this sense that I could be more effective than I was actually being. But the thing that really clinched the deal in this internal conflict that was emerging for me was being introduced to this whole new paradigm about leadership and organizations based on new science thinking, such as systems thinking and chaos theory and quantum theory, which was all about self-organizing systems and boundaries and signals and strange attractors. And so all of this really resonated really strongly with the things that my mother had taught me growing up, and with the whole Jungian paradigm that I'd been part of when I was younger. But most of all, it was like the principles that were being called out by the new science thinking corresponded beautifully with the contents of my basket of clues to my secret riddle that I had been carrying around. It was like things like, ambiguity and openness and vulnerability and paradox were precisely the things that I had been hiding all those years. So this was really new and exciting for me. And it was as if the whole new leadership paradigm became like this Rosetta Stone that enabled me to take the contents of my basket of clues to my secret riddle and translate them into a language that other people were already speaking, so that I could finally begin to give meaning to my riddle. And knowing that what was really called for was what I was able and ready to give, and that none of that was welcome in my current job, just really increased my sense of frustration with my corporate life. And that increasing frustration finally led to my recognition that it was time for me to move on to the next phase of my quest. And so I quit my job and I returned to my radical roots, but this time with a much greater sense of vulnerability and connectedness and a much more open kind of presence. And I began to bring my riddle back out into the open again, which was, if you remember, how does the archetype of the sacred prostitute inform and support social change? So I quit my job and I started to get engaged again with some local grassroots movements and to be involved with groups that were learning and practicing the methodologies of the new science thinking. And throughout all this activity, I had two goals. And one was to minimize as much as possible that gap between who I really am and who I was showing up as. And the other one was to explore the implications of the sense that I had made of my riddle using the Rosetta Stone of the new science thinking. Because it seemed to me that the two had so much in common that I wanted to see what would happen if I really started to show up giving voice and presence to the sacred prostitute within me, within the context of groups of people who were saying that they were practicing very similar values. And so in order to test that, I pushed everything to the extreme. So I didn't just show up as being open and honest. I was sometimes gut-wrenchingly open and honest. And I wasn't just vulnerable. Sometimes I was so vulnerable it was almost creepy. Sometimes it was so intense I scared myself to death. And I was sure I was going to get kicked out of the groups. So you want to know what happened? Well, of course, I did really piss some people off. But most of all, it was just really fun. It felt so good to finally be myself again after all those years. And over time, people started to come up to me and say things like, "You changed my life," which, to me, that was a pretty big deal. Or, "I learned so much by watching how you expressed yourself in our meeting last month." Or, "The way you were present in that discussion has shifted the dynamics in our group." And, so to me, what all that feedback meant was that I'd been on the right track all those years, and that the archetype of the sacred prostitute really could inform and support social change, and that her presence is actually crucial to the project of saving the world. So after all those years, I finally had a receptive community in which I could actually give voice and presence to that sacred prostitute within myself. And that community became like a medium in which the seed crystal of my riddle that I'd been carrying around for over 30 years finally crystallized into a framework. And this framework is the articulation of the sense that I made of my riddle. And the riddle was, again, how can the archetype of the sacred prostitute inform and support social change? And this framework identifies deeply held societal beliefs as well as behaviors that we all engage in but we're barely aware of that limit our ability to catalyze change. But it doesn't just show us our limits, it also identifies beliefs and behaviors that any one of us could adopt to begin to bring forth those seeds that had been languishing in all of our hearts all these years, as well as to become that more receptive community that can hold and nourish those seeds that emerge, so that together we can all begin to catalyze that better future that we're looking for. And so, ever since this framework came to me, I've been sharing it with people and getting feedback and refining it, and then teaching it to people in workshops and refining it some more and practicing it myself everywhere I go and writing about it. And so this video is the beginning of taking this framework beyond my local community and beginning to share it with a broader world.